wait for a minute? Yeah, sorry. Excellent. Professor Stephen Davis, we're delighted to have you again with us here now to moderate our next panel discussion. What do investors or institutional investors look for in board governance? The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome back. We're delighted to have the next panel looking at what do institutional investors look for in board governance. And the way I was thinking about this is that we obviously have many companies in the region that are not traded companies. They may be private sector, family-owned, or state-owned, or state-controlled companies. And so why would you be interested in a panel like this? And my feeling is that the reason is because the way institutional investors from around the world look at boards will give you an insight and a window into the cutting-edge thinking about what boards should be doing, whether they are at a publicly traded company or at a private company or where there's a reference shareholder. It's still about what makes a board a great board, to make a company a great company that is sustainable over time through sometimes family generations. It really depends on the quality of the governance of a board. And this panel is going to look at this question from the point of view of institutional investors. I'm also delighted that for us to look at this question, we have three of the most experienced people to help us give guidance on it. And actually, they're all online except for me, and I'm kind of happy about that because normally, as many of you probably are like me, for the last 3 years, we've only been doing virtual panels, and I'm always forgetting to unmute myself. And today, I don't have to worry about that. So that's very good. So it's just my three panelists that will have to worry about it. So let me start by introducing them, if I might. And I actually have had the pleasure of knowing all three for many, many years. And not only just knowing them, but also respecting them and watching what they've achieved in the marketplace. Each of them can be said to be leaders in stewardship, investor stewardship, not just in single markets, but all over the world. So let me start and I'll be brief with the introductions. I hope my panelists will forgive me, but I want to make sure to leave enough time for conversation. I'll start with Paul Lee, who's head of stewardship and sustainable investment strategy at Redington, and doubtless Paul will tell us about Redington in a few moments. But he is in charge, as I say, of stewardship. But the way I got to know him is when he was, for about a dozen years, at Hermes Equity Ownership Services, which was really and remains a pioneer in stewardship based in London. Paul was then at the National Association of Pension Funds in the UK, and then at Aberdeen Asset Management for some time. And then after that has been so important in developing initiatives, say at the ICGN, including things like the model mandate, which talks about how investors should work with asset managers. So Paul has really been leading from a number of different platforms, and he'll doubtless tell us more about that in a few moments. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hans Christoph Hirt. Hans actually also was at Hermes and was CEO there for in recent years, and led before that the firm's activist European fund. But he is now at UBS Asset Management, head of impact engagement for UBS, which is, again, one of the largest asset managers in the world. He's also still a non-executive director at Hermes Pension Trustees Limited, so he has the perspective also as a trustee. And then last but not least, Christina Unguranu is governance manager at the Qatar Investment Authority. She was appointed to that position in November of 2021. And before that, she was head of corporate governance at Eurizon Capital, the asset management company of the Italian banking group Intesa Sanpaolo. Before that, Christina worked in international corporate and academic environments in South Africa, the UK, and Italy. And she's also, importantly for today, co-chair of the ICGN's Global Governance Committee and a member of the Italian Association of Non-Executive Directors. I should mention that while Christina is currently, as I said, a governance manager at the Qatar Investment Authority, she'll be speaking about her global experiences of working and studying governance issues. So from a broad experience, not just QIA. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn to the panelists, and I'll start with Paul, to just ask them to give us an introduction about their institution and also what stewardship means according to their experience. So, Paul, can I start with you? And remember to unmute.
You can indeed, Stephen. Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the opportunity. So, Reddington is an investment consultancy. We help asset owners, mostly pension funds, but other long-term owners of investment assets, so endowments and foundations, to be better investors, to think more about the long term and to preserve value, enhance value over that long-term horizon. So actually these days, although as Stephen has said, I historically have been on the ground, face-to-face, carrying out engagement activities myself, talking directly to companies and trying to get them to change. These days, my role is much more helping those asset owners to be better stewards. And for them, in most part, that means holding their fund managers to account for doing their job properly. So we have built a series of tools to help asset owners really understand what it is that their fund managers are doing for them, and to start to understand whether what they're doing is good enough. So we're working with those clients, with the asset owners, to get the right information and insight about stewardship activities from their fund managers, And then we're interrogating that and really trying to understand whether that is delivering for the asset owners, looking at it not through the lens of the stories that the fund managers want to tell, but actually what matters to the asset owner. So thinking about what are the biggest exposures for the asset owner, both in terms of value and in terms of risk, and focusing on those areas, and also focusing on the issues that most matter to that asset owner. So if that particular asset owner cares very much about employee relations or human rights, we can make sure that we focus on those issues at those largest exposures and really try to understand whether that asset owners, fund managers are doing a good enough job in that space. If they aren't doing a good enough job, and sadly that is a little bit too often the case, we then work with the asset owner to encourage the fund management firm to do more and do differently. That's on sort of stewardship more generally. We also particularly focus on voting activity, because that is an area where, in our experience, asset owners are quite overwhelmed with the amount of data that's available. And we take all of that data in, the tens of thousands of individual resolutions that are voted on behalf of most asset owners by their fund managers. We take all that data into a technology platform and we turn it into information. And again, we look at it through the lens of the biggest exposures for that asset owner, the issues that they really care about, and identify those votes that really particularly matter to the pension fund or other asset owner that we're working for. So that's Redington and our approach to stewardship. Stephen.
Thank you, Paul. And we'll get further into, as we cover this through this session, what Redington and your good self would have to say about board governance. But let me turn now to Hans, and if you could give us a sense of your role and how you see stewardship.
Thank you, Stephen, and it's great to be with you today. One thing I realized when I joined UBS was that one of the many advantages is that you don't really need to explain who UBS is and what they do. But it's basically a big global bank and has a major asset management business, as Stephen said, currently looking at around 1 trillion assets under management, and it's really across different asset classes, different styles, traditional, alternative, real estate, infrastructure, public and private equity, and working for a range of clients, institutional investors, financial intermediaries, private clients, and all of that worldwide. What isn't, I think, so well known is the very, very long track record looking at corporate governance from an investor perspective. So we have actually facilitated voting on behalf of our clients since 1995, so well before any of us, certainly me, joined the industry, and had our first policy in 1998. And one document I really recommend reading is the current voting policy we have put out, which is much more than a voting policy. It's really corporate governance principles of UBS Asset Management. So we see corporate governance very much as sort of fundamental to protect value, to enhance value, and underpin sustainability and wealth creation, which is really integral to the business we do at UBS. Let me say a few words about the relationship, corporate governance, ESG, stewardship, and particularly the dialogue with executives and board members, which we will come to later. So ESG, I always like to think as a sort of additional lens which we can apply when we invest. And sustainable investing really uses this lens, this additional information to come to better informed investment decisions. So sustainable investing is one, looking at how can we integrate ESG information in investment decision-making processes. The other really important aspect of sustainable investing is stewardship, and looking after, once you are invested, looking at your assets and trying to encourage change, but also just learning more about the investments you have made. And that's a really important part here at UBS Asset Management. We have a stewardship policy. We are members of the Principles for Responsible Investment, and we are also signatories to a number of stewardship codes, including here in the UK, in making really commitments around stewardship. But maybe very briefly, what does it mean, stewardship, for us? It's probably 5 key things. One is building relationships with companies. So once you're invested, as an investor, you can go to companies, have a conversation with investor relations, but also executives and non-executive directors. And then we track this internally, the information we get from these conversations, but also when we make progress, when we encourage change at companies. So that's something we track internally. Then we vote on all resolutions globally, wherever that's practically possible. And that's a very important part of stewardship. Then we work with other shareholders when appropriate, when it makes sense, when it's facilitating more change. And ultimately, we report back to our clients on all of this. Just a little bit more on engagement. So as I said, engagement is the dialogue between investors with executives and non-executive directors, and we will come to this later on. But the question of us, why do we do it? I mean, it's basically to try to identify long-term issues that matter for the companies, not just identify them, but sometimes also encourage change on these topics. We engage on governance topics, so traditional things like board composition, incentivization, overall governance structures of companies. We also engage on sustainability topics. So everything, particularly climate change, is a really important topic. And again, it's sort of twofold. One, you learn, you get additional information which you can factor into investment decision making, but you have also the opportunity to provide feedback, encourage change. And voting really underpins all of this. And voting is effectively an economic value that is attached to your shares. And we use this to voice our opinion once we have looked at the company, but also to give a little bit of force when we are in disagreement on specific topics. We vote globally. I'm in over 60 countries, both for actively managed and our passive or rule-based strategies. We generally like to support management. We are very much long-term shareholders. We want to work with boards and with executives, but there are also occasions where we come to the conclusion that we need to vote against on behalf of our clients. All of this underpinned by a very detailed policy, which I mentioned earlier, which is very much worth a read, which sets out our principles. These are principles, and we apply them flexibly across different markets and also where appropriate, depending on the company circumstances. Now, coming to an end, why do we do all of this? Because we think it's in the financial interests of our clients. That's the absolute most important thing, and we're trying to promote positive change in boardrooms with companies in doing this and in achieving really the best outcomes for our clients. I think I stop here, and thank you for the time and listening.
Thank you, Hans. Much appreciated. And finally, for the introductory remarks, Christina.
Yes, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Huckermacher, because I'm very pleased to speak at this venue. It's quite important for this region and globally as well. So I would like to give a more generic flavor of the concept of stewardship, as I have had the benefit, or maybe the challenge, to work in corporate governance, both on the side of the company, the issuer company, like you mentioned, Stephen, South Africa, UK, and more recently on the institutional investor side. So stewardship is a concept that has built in my corporate governance development and career for a long time, and I'm sure it's a ongoing development, as we all know, and there are skills across the institutional investor world as well as the company world, developing skills in speaking to each other, having dialogues, analyzing companies. So it's a very important concept. But I always start from the pure definition of stewardship. Stewardship is the responsible management of what is entrusted to you. So we should not forget that, and I always go back to this definition in my work. So stewardship from an investor perspective is an approach to investment strategy, investment decisions that improves the value that an enterprise creates for the society, that the company creates for the society. We all acknowledge that investors have a role in scrutinizing investments and determining whether investee companies are fulfilling their corporate purpose. I also had the pleasure to work as an academic, so I studied corporate governance also aside of my practical experience. And there are many studies now emerging related to the importance of stewardship. And both academics and practitioners indeed indicate and actually demonstrate that investors should use stewardship activities to engage in dialogue with investee companies to hold them accountable. So certainly, as we all acknowledge, stewardship is a relevant activity, both from investor, and I would really like to add, and a corporate perspective. Going back to the definition that I mentioned before, the dialogue, this collaboration between investors and companies is always two-way. So there is always a mutual dialogue in order to promote this effective collaboration between companies and investors. So I always like to look at this concept also from the company perspective. And what I would also like to emphasize is proactiveness. Proactiveness also from the side of the company in communicating with investors. So proactiveness, engagement, the call for dialogue should not always come from the investors, but also, in my view, it should come from the company. And this applies to both, as you said, Stephen, listed and private companies. So we should not forget that this is a concept that is important in corporate governance also for private companies. And actually, from my experience working with companies in emerging markets and with investors in emerging markets, including regions and countries in the area that we are currently are based on, and specifically the GCC region, the Gulf region, in many situations, this proactiveness in engaging in dialogue with investors comes from the issuer companies. And this is a very interesting thing to notice, at least from my side, and I think a very positive stance, particularly as companies in the region are in the process of adopting global best practices in corporate governance and sustainability. I also would like to emphasize the fact that was approached by previous speakers, that stewardship is interlinked with the approach of ESG integration strategies. And going back to investors, also from my experience and from what I consider it is very relevant, the ESG strategy and integration into the investment process, when we speak about investors, cannot be driven by just one team alone. Rather, it must be embedded across the entire organization, where ESG specialists, including, let's say, stewardship specialists, also, let's say, more inclined to environmental and social technical issues specialists, but also teams such as legal, admin, they need to interact and more so collaborate with investment teams with some coordination, of course, in order to ensure proper oversight. So this is an important matter, and I've experienced this across the organization that I've been pleased to collaborate with. And what I would like also to highlight, speaking about this oversight, is the importance of the role of the executive suite or the executive committee, depending on how the organization is structured, in helping to define strategy, to make assessments and evaluations of potential investments, and assess potential collaborations. So the executive team serves as a champion within the organization to promote and drive ESG projects, stewardship approach, and to promote these values across the decision lines. This is something that more and more working in this field, I find that is extremely important. And what I like to call this whole coordination and oversight within the organization, I like to call it the stewardship spirit or the ESG spirit. It is a culture that is embedded in the organization. So from my experience, we are really heading towards these extremely positive approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. And I hope everyone maybe has the same impression I have, in that when we look at and hear the voices of our three panelists, what we are hearing is the voice of a really new, important discipline within the capital market. So you are hearing the voice of what investors are now, how they are now configured to play a role in relation to companies around the world. And so they sort of have now set out, with those three introductory comments, a sense about what stewardship is, at least you know, in the broad sense. Now, what I'd like to do before we get into some of the nitty-gritty about boards, what you expect about boards, I wonder if you could give us each, in each of your cases, an example from your exposure in the governance world, kind of at least one vivid example of a stewardship encounter that proved constructive, and if it's relevant to you, another one that proved a failure. So we can give our audience a very sort of practical sense about what this ethereal stewardship idea means in the real world. And Paul, maybe I'd ask you to start again, if you wouldn't mind.
Of course, Stephen. It probably says something about me, but the ones that stick in my mind are unfortunately the failures rather than the successes. So I'll talk maybe about a couple of those failures, and the ones that are perhaps most vivid in my mind are the conversations that I had with banks in the run-up to the financial crisis, and trying to persuade board directors to take the risks that their businesses were facing seriously was a real challenge at the time. People wanted to carry on making money and wanted to believe that they were doing something so right that they deserved to be making the money that they seemed to be making at the time. So two particular banks that I had a lot of dealings with, one, and stewardship, as Christina said, is all about just dialogue. It's just talking face to face with individuals. So the first bank, it was a face-to-face encounter with the chair, a non-executive director, a non-exec chair, and I spent an hour with that individual to be the very significant risks that the bank was running in its business model, the large exposures that it had and that were building up on that balance sheet. And the chair spent most of that time essentially telling me that I didn't need to worry about it, that it was all under control, and that I actually, frankly, I was being foolish to raise these issues. And the last piece of the conversation, it didn't feel much like a conversation. Good stewardship engagement feels like a conversation where you're being listened to, and it is a dialogue. This felt like an encounter where I was putting things in front of him, and he wasn't taking any of them seriously. But the last sentence of that encounter really encapsulated that whole failure of him to listen and me to get him to listen, which was he literally said to me, "We take the issues that you are raising more seriously if you bought more shares in the company." And that just tells a story about how closed-minded that individual was, how unwilling he was to listen to issues that were, as it turned out, very sensible issues to be raising, simply on the basis of us only having about 1 percentage point of the shares of the company. If we'd been a bit bigger, maybe he would have listened, but I suspect not even then. And that bank was one of the first to fail in the financial crisis as it came through in the year or so after that encounter. A similar conversation, slightly more of a conversation this time, with another chair of a much larger bank prior to the crisis, and there again talking about some very detailed ends of the risk management approach that the bank had, trying to get under the skin of the extent to which the board understood the risks that it was taking and that the bank was facing. And this was rather more of a dialogue. There was more give and take, but actually what I took out of that particular conversation was that the chair himself did not really understand the risks that the bank was facing, and he was very reliant on the executive team, and that did not tell a good story about the quality of the board, the ability of the board to challenge and debate and to make sure that the bank was only running risks that it ought to be running, and it meant that we were very hesitant about the future of that bank as well. That bank happily did not fail, but it had a very, very difficult few years, and there were very substantial changes to the membership of the board to get it into a place where it was much better able to manage the risks that it was facing. So two failures of stewardship, I'm afraid, rather than more positive stories. Those are the ones that stick in my mind, unfortunately.
Thank you, Paul. Maybe if I could extract some maybe some assumptions or lessons from that is that, for one thing, when you enter into dialogue with boards, what will come away as something positive for you is when a board director is not only telling you how the company is doing, but also listening to you from your perspective as having been invested in a variety of different companies within that sector often, and to hear what you have to say about the company. So you're looking for boards or directors that have that two-way communication characteristic. And I guess the second point that I'm hearing from you is you want to make sure that even if someone is a non-executive leader of a board, that they know the business, that they know the company, and that they're capable, in other words, of being able to evaluate what they're hearing from management, from their own personal experience. Is that fair reflection?
That's exactly right. Yeah, any individual, no matter how senior, needs to recognize that they've always got something to learn, and that learning can come from anywhere. And we certainly look for board members who are willing to listen, willing to hear. They may not always agree with what it is that we as investors are wanting to share with them, but they ought to enter into that dialogue with an open mind. And those situations that have been least successful in my experience are the ones where the directors clearly are not entering into them with an open mind.
And would it be further fair to say that what might represent good stewardship, just as we're talking about what represents a good board director, is stewardship that also listens and not just sort of, you're not, I hope you're not saying you're dictating to companies how to behave. You're also wanting to hear from them and to be convinced. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And I think engagement is more about listening than it is about speaking as an investor. And I spend 45 minutes and more of any hour-long encounter with a director simply asking questions, getting them to speak, trying to understand their perspective. And it's only a small portion of that meeting where I will be asserting something or making a point that I really think they shouldn't be ignoring.
All right, thank you, Paul. Hans, what examples might you have to share?
Yeah, great question. And I was sort of wondering about is failure the right way to term some of this engagement, and I'd explain why I think I should also say, I mean, my examples are clearly from my life as my previous employer, since I've only recently joined UBS. But one example that came to mind, so very positive, was a major company here in the UK that had a very strong CEO that had been around for many years, and very, very successfully running a company, building a company. And we really had concerns about, is he too strong? Does he get enough challenge? Is there space for discussion in the boardroom? But then also very much about succession. What happens if that person, if something happens to that person? So we took the opportunity to really intensively engage with a new chair that came in, and over many meetings, and I think Paul is right, there was a lot of listening about the importance of the CEO, but there was also a clear message from us representing investors. We have a concern about the strong role of this person, and also some suggestions. Could you think more as chair about structured succession planning? Could you report to the outside world that you are addressing this? And over many meetings over a couple of years, and I think there was a meeting of minds, and things started to move forward. It was much clearer what the succession plan was. There was also addressing of excessive remuneration along the way, and that really helped when it then came to an occasion where the CEO had to leave the company to have a much more robust plan that was ready. So I would call this a real success. Investors working with that chair together. Then another positive example which just came to mind, Stephen, when you talked about also about listening, and this is a German company in Germany, two-tier board, management board, supervisory board, and generally investors don't want the CEO to move up to the supervisory board. That's something sort of frowned upon in the German corporate governance system. So we were faced with a successful company, and it was proposed CEO moves up to be the chair of the company. And generally, I mean, just tick box approach would have said, no, this is not good for the company, it's not good governance. We took the time to go out, meet with that individual, sort of test his personality, test also the challenges the companies was facing, looking at his track record. And ultimately, we concluded we're actually quite happy in this particular occasion that he moves up from being CEO to chair. Now coming back to the point why I sort of challenged calling it a failure. Again, that's an example from my native country, Germany, where we went to a headquarters of again, from the outside, seemingly successful company, and we sat down with the chair, actually for a quite long meeting, lots of listening. But in this meeting, it became very apparent that he really lacked an understanding of the business, and not just the business, but also the associated risks. And it also turned out that he was really admiring the CEO for what he had achieved. So overall, a really concerning conclusion of that meeting. But is that a failure? I think it then depends on what you do with the information to protect the assets of your clients. And if you take this information away into your investment decision-making processes, then I think I wouldn't call it a failure, but then actually you have gained something and protected your clients' assets from damage and deterioration. I think I stop here, and but happy to talk more later.
Thank you, Hans. And again, just to extract one thought or reaction from your comment is, it sounds as if what you really want to do to help protect value is to establish your bona fides with the company and to maintain a long-term relationship with them, so that they understand you, the company understands where you're coming from, and they feel that they can talk to you, and that they can also listen back, and that sometimes you as an investor will move away from your otherwise sort of general practice if you feel that it makes sense for the company.
Yeah, I think really good description. I'd always thought ideally the company, the chair, or someone, a non-executive director, would reach out to investors and sort of have a conversation if there's some change needed, or if they need some input on a specific corporate governance topic. So absolutely, I think it's really about a relationship and sort of mutual trust and credibility of both sides.
So in a way, the ideal is for both parties to become trusted partners together. That's the positive case. Christina, if I could turn to you.
Yes, for sure. Very interesting examples. What I would want to emphasize is, let's say, being optimist. What is important, I think, in order to be a good steward is, of course, the dialogue, and of course, listening, and also being transparent and sincere. Next step is the tracking progress or following up on your stewardship activity or your specific engagement, or a negative, let's say, example when these things do not happen. So at least from my experience, often not necessarily the organization I worked for, but engagement is done just for the sake of engagement. Well, no. Stewardship is an approach, but it's also an action, an activity that needs to have a certain objective. So before you engage with a company, you have to have a certain objective, why you do engage with a company. And then, of course, as an investor, you aim for the company to improve its practices in certain areas. Let's say on board governance or executive remuneration, on environmental or social disclosure, etc. Therefore, you need to be truly engaged in this journey, also by constantly monitoring. So this is something that an investor should invest in, let's say, time and effort in order to monitor and to track progress and to show the company that certain topics are of importance to you. Therefore, there needs to be an ongoing dialogue with the company also in order to monitor the progress made. And also to give the company further feedback as to how you perceive the company progresses on those areas. So I think this is something that is extremely important, and in the stewardship engagement in the sense of time investment and a lot of knowledge and knowing the company and owning the portfolio companies. It is something that is perhaps sometimes overlooked, and an engagement may stop after a first dialogue. No, it needs to be ongoing. And as I said, needs to be proactive from both sides. And related to this, voting was mentioned, voting, and of course voting is an important element of the stewardship activity. A negative, or let's say a positive aspect when this is happening, is reacting to negative votes, even though the number, the percentage of the negative votes may be minor. Let's say 10% of negative votes on a certain topic are still relevant. So the company needs to go back to investors and explain what they are doing in order to fulfill the expectations of investors. Investors need to engage with the company on those issues that still passed in terms of resolutions, however, are a concern on the investor side. And I know that in UK there is also some regulation around it, and perhaps in other jurisdictions as well, but this is an important element, the follow-up, the proactiveness into monitoring progress on the side of the company, and an ongoing dialogue, not to lose it after, let's say, a first engagement. Thanks.
Thank you, Christina. And maybe, again, if I could just draw out maybe an implication of what you've said. I think you stressed an extremely important additional aspect of this relationship between investors and companies, and that is that there's an enormous amount of research, due diligence, analysis that stewardship, if it's done right, needs to do, so that when you enter into a dialogue with a company, you as an investor know that company pretty well. And what's fascinating about this moment in time is that maybe in the past companies had been able to control a lot of the information about themselves, right? If you needed information, you got it from the company. But today, as I think we all know, there's this vast new industry of analytics, and they are drawing information about companies, not just from the companies, but from an array of big data and AI and all kinds of outside sources that are not in control of the company. So even if it's a company that's not a public company, corporations have to, or now understand that their profile in the world is defined not just by the information they control, but by a whole vast variety of sources beyond just the usual media, but other sources. Is that, Christina, does that seem to be right?
Absolutely, and this reflects a lot also my work, as you kindly mentioned in ICGN, as within our Global Governance Committee. We stress that a lot, and there is a huge amount of resources that are important for investors. Of course, the direct
we
a lot of work going in, engage with every company in order to engage. Now, what company will you engage with? Is it just the ownership that you have in the company, the level of ownership? Are there ESG controversies that are more important, also from a systemic perspective? So this is extremely important. And what I would like to add, perhaps on a positive note, is just came to mind. Stewardship is certainly an engaging with the individual companies, or the dialogue between investors and companies, but also contributing from the side of investors to improving global best practices. And there are a lot of examples where investors start to collaborate. And I think this is a positive example of stewardship. And I'm sure, well, Hans and Paul also apply it, where more and more collaboration happens among investors, among institutional investors, in order to improve the world of corporate governance frameworks. And we have, of course, so many examples, especially lately, with a lot of standards and regulations coming out, but also some examples where investors can really have a voice into defining frameworks, into defining such regulations. And of course, for example, let's say the European Commission latest directives, there are so many on the table right now, have proved that investors gather, they respond to consultation, they are really stewards also in that sense, because you cannot just follow certain rules or regulations or frameworks, but you have the responsibility to contribute to defining these frameworks. And this was something I actually wanted to add also, as from my point of view, it is part of the definition of stewardship, and it is a very positive trend that is happening where investors are not competitive only, but they are collaborating. So this is something that I really like always seeing.
Thank you very much, Christine. And I want to just take this moment to invite our audience online, as well as here in the room in Dubai, to consider questions that they may wish to pose. And I'm happy to, I mean, we could do that at the end, but if there are questions that arise throughout, someone will alert me if there are some that come on screen, and we can pose them, you know, as even during the panel. So please, you know, feel free to pose questions. So I'm going to pose one now, which gets directly to our the topic, which is, you know, what do investors look for in board governance? I wonder if you could each share with us what you think of as a good board. What's one that's a mediocre board? What's not a good board? In other words, how do you assess whether a board has high or low governance risk for you? And again, I think that's useful even for companies that are not publicly traded, because they can get insights from the answers here, I think, about what people think of in the capital market. What is a good board? Paul, do you want to kick off?
Oh, I'll give it a go. I mean, I would probably think about it in three separate areas. One is board skills, the second is independence, and the third is board behaviours. And I think all three of them are necessary. And if any one of those three is absent, then you do have risk. So on skills, you need a board with knowledge and insight of the business and the business environment in which it operates. So, you know, understanding of that particular piece of the operation, but also adjacent businesses that might interact with it, that can give you that different insight into what is going on in that business area, can help provide challenge and different perspectives and so on, and skills around the key risk areas that particular business faces as well. On the independence, there is a need for the individuals around the boardroom table to have an independence of view from just what the executives are providing, so that there is an ability to see things from different angles, and we all need to capture those different perspectives to reach the best decision making that we can. If everybody is of the same mind, aligned just with a particular perspective, there is clearly going to be a vulnerability there that just isn't necessary. And then finally, the board behaviours part of it is about the chair in particular having a role of drawing out those different perspectives that there are around the boardroom, drawing on those different skills that there are in the boardroom, and making sure that the different voices and the different perspectives are heard. The whole point of a board is that a group of people is much stronger than just one individual as a decision-making body. You need the behaviours within the boardroom that take advantage of that group advantage that you have, the benefit of it being a set of minds rather than just one mind. So those three areas, as I say, I think each of them is necessary and important for a board to function well and to be delivering.
So just to sort of close the loop on that, you as an investor would seek to assure yourself that those characteristics, skills, independence, board leadership, are in place to the maximum level. And if they are not, then you would enter into dialogue, at least in the first instance, with the entity, with the board.
Yeah, exactly. You have the conversations with the people around the boardroom and try to gain reassurance that those three elements are delivered on. And if you continue to worry that there are gaps in any one of those three areas, you push for change, which is most often, you know, adding one or two new voices to the board with those additional perspectives that will really add value to the business.
But I don't think we can underestimate how difficult a task it is to arrive at an accurate assessment of those, let's say, three characteristics. Just skill sets, that's maybe perhaps the easiest one to do. You can see if skills are present. Independence is a tough one, isn't it? Because, you know, someone may look independent on paper, but there may be lots of things that are not disclosed that you may not be able to determine that would lead to questions about an individual's independence. So presumably that's the challenge that you face.
Of course it is, and that's why listening when you're in an engagement meeting with a director is so important, because you can test and probe and just try to draw the individual out, and from that you can gain an impression as to whether they have the independence of mind, which is what matters after all, to deliver. And then also, very importantly, whether they do actually in practice deliver it in the boardroom and in the discussions that really matter. And you can't take that last bit for granted at all, just because an individual is independent of mind. You know, if you do gain the confidence that they are in fact that.
But equally, presumably there's the challenge is to the board to be able to mount a set of arguments or communications that are credible and that can convince you that they are, in fact, meeting high governance quality. So for a board, there are implications for not just their composition, but also their being able to communicate all this effectively and persuasively to outsiders. So Hans, you could perhaps weigh in.
Yeah, difficult to come after Paul, who of course delivered the textbook answer. But maybe just add a couple of points. I think first and foremost, and I think this sometimes got lost when the independence discussion came in. It's really about relevant experience and skills in the right sectors and the right markets. And I include in this not just where does a company sit, but also where our customers live. But then also critically, last few years is an excellent example, supply chain, relevant knowledge about the industry, so going all the way down in the value chain, and relevant knowledge and experience in this regard. We had an interesting call with the chair of a big company yesterday, and he said he wants people who have run big companies rather than sort of experts on specific topics, and he called this applied expertise. So not bringing in someone who's just an expert on something, but someone who has actually dealt with the issue in practice, in running or being very senior in a big companies. Then, of course, it's about diversity of backgrounds, different perspectives, and independence. Yes, an open and challenging mindset, and sometimes also I find it's really helpful if Nets can sort of take the investor perspective and sometimes step in the shoes of someone who has given and trusted their funds with the company. Something that is useful in judging the independence and the sort of overall performance potential contribution is a track record at other companies. So it's still a relatively small universe of non-executive directors, and you just come across the same people again and again, and you can look at what have they done or not done in some of the previous appointments. And then we are in a territory where it's very difficult, and we at my old shop we used to call this hard and soft factors. So some things you can assess looking at the person, but there's also soft factors which are very difficult to assess from the outside. And this is all before talking about how does a group then work together. You can have brilliant individuals, but if it doesn't work as a group, then you face a problem. And I think board evaluation, external board evaluation, can give you a little bit of reassurance, maybe point you to the right question, but very often it's really the in-person conversation that is necessary and gives you more flavor about how a board works, how individuals work, and typically also conversation with different people on the board, not just with the chair, but sort of getting the whole picture requires talking to multiple non-executive directors.
Yeah, and Hans, thank you for also reminding us that it's the board's, one of the tools that a board might have to convince, well, first of all, to address the question of its own quality, but also to convince outsiders that its governance is of high quality, is the idea of having board assessments done. That raises a whole another set of questions as to how do you best do that, and what's the most effective, what's the most convincing, how do you make it work, and who should do it. Those are, maybe we can get to those, but let's set that aside for a moment. It's still a good reminder that that's in the toolbox of a board when it's trying to work on its own quality and communicate with others about it. Christina.
Yes. Yes, I totally agree with Hans and Paul and with your final remarks. And what I would like to emphasize is what you said just now. It's how do you assess, how do you build the board? And secondly, it should be a modern board. A modern board, not to say that board members should be the youngest members, but the whole board should be current and contemporary, in pace with factors such as sustainable development, innovation, technology. These are rapidly accelerating change in the global economy and affecting how companies create competitive advantage. So in this light, boards should continue to rethink and address their organizational strategy, their risk management, responding to all these challenges, and also assess whether required talent in the board is in place to deal with such challenges. So, of course, as it has been mentioned, board composition is fundamental to board effectiveness, of course, for companies and as well as for assuring investors. And boards may need to rethink their own composition and structure to, and I would say, stay fit for the purpose. Boards need to be fit for the purpose, for the company that they serve. I would like to add an important aspect, which I think is relevant to many investors, is how you compose the board. And the succession planning here, the succession planning process, I think it's relevant not just for the executive level, and more important also for the board level. This benefits greatly if the board has a clear understanding of what a so-called ideal board might look like. And this also enables potential candidates to the board to be assessed on the basis of whether they would move the board closer to that ideal. And certainly investors appreciate when companies communicate efforts in their succession plans also to the board, including reporting on the initiatives they have in place to develop the next cadre of board directors and of course also senior management. And I would give an interesting example in Italy, where the regulation in Italy, where I worked for several years, there is a requirement by the Corporate Governance Code for companies to issue ahead of the renewal of the board's mandate, which is there 3 years, a guidance to shareholders as to the so-called ideal board composition, following, of course, a process of thorough process of evaluation and of board composition assessment. While I think it is a very useful practice for both companies and also for informing shareholders who in Italy have the chance to propose candidates for the board of companies. So this is a practice, of course, tailored to the Italian context, where shareholders have the opportunity to nominate candidates on the board, but this whole preparation, this whole assessment of what the future board should look like is extremely important to investors, to be visionary, to be a visionary board, to assure investors that this board will handle all these new challenges. Of course, refreshment aside of succession planning, as it was mentioned before, needs to happen, and sometimes perhaps beyond succession planning, where you cannot really predict what will happen, there are some situations where more radical refreshments of the board may happen, particularly where there are concerns with board effectiveness or dynamics. And here, of course, investor activism plays a role. About the diversity, and perhaps we can dwell on that a bit more, but what I think diversity needs to be is to be productive. What productive diversity means will differ, of course, from board to board and from industry to industry. But the first important thing for the board is to understand what skills it needs now and what skills will be required for the future, as I mentioned, bearing in mind that those skills can however become outdated. For example, an experienced CEO in a certain industry, perhaps 25 years ago, may be not applicable today for the board today. So a continuous assessment and a continuous planning of these boards are extremely important. This is on the side of the composition, but of course, relating to that, and as I mentioned, modernizing boards is important. What I think, and what we all see perhaps, is a focus shifting on a long-term value creation rather than a risk-based value protection of the companies, but also from the side, of course, from the board perspective. So here, I think what I called leading boards, and perhaps some other colleagues would call them like that. So the perfect board, the leading board, will know how to embrace challenges, but also opportunities through achieving certain equilibrium, certain balance. And so it is not easy, of course, to manage all these challenges, but the balance is important between stabilizing the business in the short term and focusing on identifying opportunities for the growth in the long term. And both are equally critical. So this is why I think it's important to be visionary and to have a forward-looking board, a leading board fit for the future with regards to future industry context, seeking to understand the driving forces that are impacting on the business, such, for example, climate change and other sustainability-related issues. So a balance between looking short-term and long-term, it's extremely important also for investors. Another balance is between oversight and accountability on the one hand, while ensuring innovation and dynamism on the other. So I always stop here because we are on these important issues, short-term versus long-term, oversight, the traditional oversight and accountability versus innovation and being a dynamic board. It is important because we are at a certain period in time where we have to look on what a traditional board has been achieving so far with the traditional skills, which are extremely valuable and important, but also looking into the future to bring new perspectives, perhaps new skills, because of the new risks and new opportunities that are facing us. So it's not let's say it's perhaps not an easy task, but fortunately, boards will not have to do it alone. There is always a matter of collaboration inside the organization, but also with other organizations. And we have so much support in driving these changes towards innovation and towards transformation, towards a more dynamic society, that boards have such a huge role in playing in this transformation.
Thank you, Christine. And what I find so interesting about our three panelists' comments are that Paul started by setting out what investors would expect from boards, but where we have wound up, I think, is not just that what the investors want, but what are the implications for boards how they can convince investors and communicate their characteristics. And so Christina has reminded us of another couple of tools in the toolkit that companies have. We already talked about board assessments, but Christina mentioned information about succession is a tool that companies have at their at hand, and and also, as Christina said, is information from a company about how it is composed, and is it composed to fit best purpose at each moment in time, not just now but going forward. So and that's something that that boards themselves can put together. So it's in order to meet some of the expectations that Paul set out at the beginning. So let me take that to maybe drilling down to a question that is more relevant, I think, or most relevant to people in the how-come sphere, which is how do you handle board governance differently for a GCC company as opposed to a company in another market? Would you handle it differently? If so, how? And of course, you know, as we know, often in the GCC markets, there's a controlling shareholder, sometimes the state, as opposed to a widely held company that might be the case somewhere else. So I'm curious, how would you respond to that, Paul?
Thanks, Stephen. So I think the first answer to the question is not very differently at all. I think, you know, the principles and the ambitions that investors have for a board are true for every board, wherever in the world you happen to be. I think what does differ is perhaps the patience that the investor has, a willingness to recognize that perhaps in some markets moving forwards will take time, and that we cannot expect to see the best tomorrow. It may take a while longer, and you know, we are now 30 years into the discussion about corporate governance in the UK. It's almost exactly 30 years since the Cadbury Code, the first corporate governance code, not just in the UK but in the world, was published. And we've had 30 years in the UK and nearly that level of time in a number of markets to get to an understanding of what good looks like. We have to recognize that some markets have not had that length of time for this conversation really to have had the impact that it has had in the UK, and therefore investors need to be patient. You mentioned the issue of major shareholders, and clearly that does need to be a factor in how boards operate. It's right and fair that major shareholders will want to have a degree of board representation, or certainly a degree of comfort with the board members that are there. But equally, they should recognize that the minority investors need comfort about the board and its operations, and so in some ways that presence of a major or majority shareholder means that a board demonstrating its independence needs to be not just independence from the executive, but independence from that major shareholder as well.
Thank you, Paul. Hans.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I remember when I started at Hermes, and everyone was very UK focused, and as Paul said, UK was first with the corporate governance code, and I had then the task to engage with companies in Europe, where the corporate governance system is very different. Talked about two-tier boards, where also you encounter very often in Germany big shareholders, including state shareholders. So that was from the beginning really something on top of my mind. And I think Paul explained it sort of correctly, that there are, of course, global principles and ambitions that are the same for all of the markets. But what I think most investors realize, there are also differences in terms of the legal framework and the environment, and also in terms of the shareholding structure of companies. And, and very often large shareholders can make a very important contribution to the success of companies. And we recognize this, for example, with sort of adjusted expectations regarding independence on board of companies that are controlled. But again, absolutely right to say, there still needs to be this independent element to ensure enough challenge of the thinking of companies, and ensure the voice ultimately of the minority investor, but then also the underlying clients. So I would say there's patience, there's working with companies, there's a little bit trial and error also in the whole corporate governance journey, in the global corporate governance journey. We want to be very much part of that and take an appropriate approach in each market we operate in.
Thank you. And Christina? Yes.
Now, extremely interesting question. And of course, I've been here for a year now, but of course, following the market, the region already before. Obviously here I see the developments much more clear. And I would say, generally, I agree with Paul and Hans, there's not much difference aside from the characteristics of the market. But overall, the boards in the region have made significant progress, and in many ways are already aligned with global standards. And I'm sure Huckermach is also contributed to that and can second that. And also I was reading a few surveys, and there are more and more research papers into the region coming out with regards to board effectiveness, board governance, but generally corporate governance in the region. And it is clear that things have progressed, and of course aligning with global best practices. And specifically, there is better awareness of the board roles and responsibilities, of the board culture. The board culture is an important element that is very much that gets a lot of attention. There are solid management systems, and there is this long-term vision and long-term investment horizon, also from the board perspective. Of course, there is increasing involvement of boards into essential topics like sustainability. There is a growing accountability of climate, and I would add also linked to that climate of accountability in corporate boardrooms, of course across the globe, but also in the region. So there is a lot of attention, there is a lot of awareness towards ESG issues. But of course, one needs to respect the characteristics of the market, as was mentioned, and not to forget that there are also external factors that are positively impacting board governance, board effectiveness in the region, including changes in listing rules, in company laws, and embracing international corporate governance and wider ESG standards, and not least investor interest, as was mentioned by my colleagues earlier. So there is, I don't want to say pressure, and this is what is nice to see, there's not necessarily pressure, but there is an awareness that all these things are important. Things are adjusting, and boards are also following all these global developments. It is important to adapt and to consider the characteristics of the region, and specifically certainly the controlling shareholder element, the characteristics, and also the importance of corporate governance in private companies and wider ESG developments. So private companies are obviously more particular, and in these markets, of course, it is important to consider private markets as well. Where ownership agenda is very important, and strategic questions are made with the question in mind: where is sustainable development in line with the company's purpose, in line with the strategy? So private companies are seriously considering these questions, not to mention family companies in the region where you have a personal commitment towards the strategy. So the next generation is looking after how you are developing the strategy and requires action. And the whole board and management need to be committed to this strategy and to the sustainability development. Another important thing is innovation, as I mentioned before. And I think, and it is somehow much easier to make transformational decisions in a private company. Well, for sure, it is not impossible for a public company, only that, of course, for a public company, you need to convince a wider group of shareholders who are less familiar. So the board has to have a very compelling story motivating this innovation. In private companies, perhaps there is much more control over your own innovation. So this is a positive, somehow, characteristics that facilitates board governance, facilitates corporate governance and corporate strategic decisions, which it's a very interesting characteristics, which of course needs to be considered from an investor perspective, but also from a wider stakeholder perspective.
Thank you.
But not, yes, not to say that investors, however, have an important role also in the regions, not just helping boards focus on the right issues, but also by empowering them and giving them the confidence to make the right decisions.
Thank you, Christina. And I think you've reminded us that there is maybe a tension between general governance standards worldwide and particular characteristics within a market, and that always has to be reconciled. We've only gotten through maybe a fraction of the questions that we had put together, but I want to make sure, because we do have just a few minutes left, to call. There's a question from the audience. YT, please.
Hi, YT Mark from Singapore. Hi, Hans, long time no see. Yeah, I want to, I just was talking to BlackRock a couple of weeks ago, right, and the head of stewardship for Asia Pacific, and clearly one of the challenges you hear from asset managers is that in Asia, you can't talk to the boards often, right? Your engagement is only with the CEO in many cases. So how do you, throughout the conversation, most of you will seems to be saying that at least you can talk to some members of the board, but that seems to be a bit of a challenge in Asia. So in that situation, how do you assess whether the board is fit for purpose, and then how do you make decisions whether to support the re-election of directors in that situation where you can't even interact with the board? Thank you.
Thanks, YT. Anyone want to pick that one up?
Yeah, happy, and nice to see you again. I think the answer is I was based in Singapore in 2014 for Hermes, and I think in Asia, probably like in most markets, but particularly in Asia, relationship building is crucial. And I had the ability, flexibility to spend time in all major markets in Asia. And if, in my experience at the time, 2014, a few years ago, if you spend the time, develop the relationship, you will get to the board in due course. So I had I think in all major markets, after half a year developing the relationship, the possibility to meet with board members. But it takes much more time and effort to build a relationship before you get that meeting. It's not like here in the UK where companies almost come to you before you can contact them. That's a really important point, but it's just the access isn't the same in every market.
Anybody else want to pick that up? Because it's an excellent question.
Yeah, I would just want to stress that communication and obviously information is extremely important. As the questions very well highlighted, you cannot, sometimes investors do not engage with boards and boards do not engage with investors. How do you elect board members? And of course, not an easy task, but it is important not only that the board members themselves are fully informed and are fully knowledgeable about the context of the company, but also that they can demonstrate to other stakeholders, to shareholders and other stakeholders that they are informed. So board communication towards stakeholders is extremely important, and shareholders need to really have the comfort that the board has explored the full spectrum of risks that the organization has faced, the opportunities that is ahead of them, ahead of the organization, and that the right information has been supplied and the right questions asked. So it is very much about informing on the side of the board and directors towards the stakeholder world, their activity.
Thank you very much, Christina. I'm afraid we're out of time, and I wanted to sort of hope that, or say that I hope that we've been able to cover or give everyone a glimpse as to what stewardship has given rise to as far as expectations by investors on board quality, and what boards need to think about to convince people such as our three distinguished panelists that they are in fact the best configured to drive value over the long term for the company. So it remains for me to thank Paul and Hans and Christina for your time and your wisdom and for sharing all of your insights with us today. We're very grateful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Opportunity.
Thank you, Professor. May I suggest that we have some extra refreshments outside if anyone wants to grab their coffee, a refreshment, and then come back directly for our third panel. Okay. So we'll just give you a couple of minutes to grab your refreshments and coffee. Shall we start? So, having gone through the ESG regulatory framework and the investors' expectations, we now turn to the boards of directors. And we will have Dr. Ashraf Jamaluddin elaborate with his panel guests on how boards oversee ESG implementation. Dr. Ashraf?
Thank you. Okay, so the final session. Thank you so much for being here. Now, what I know is we have lots of people actually following us online. What I want to tell you is we do have two big groups on WhatsApp, which have the corporate governance professionals in the MENA region, and they are actually asking lots of things and following up with us, and they are following on the session. So thank you for being here. Now, I'd like to call on the stage Sandra Guerra. She's a board director and founding partner at Better Governance in Brazil. She is one of the leading governance experts in Brazil, and she has been doing a lot of very interesting work for companies as well as in family businesses. Now, for this session also, we have two distinguished speakers. We have Karina Litvak. She is non-executive director at Eni in the UK. And also we have Colin Lowe, Diligent Advisory Board member, Singapore. Now, in this session, what we'll do is, in fact, we will focus on the role of the boards and who should be taking the lead in the area of ESG in companies. So we have been talking about, importance of sustainability, ESG, from the regulatory perspective, from investors' perspective, but then what? What are the implications for companies and for boards of directors of these companies? So this is the final session, so please try to be engaged. That's why we gave you 15 minutes to get some coffee so that you are energized. Okay, so I'd like to thank everyone for being here. So can we start with you, Sandra? Give us your overview of, in your point of view, what would be, in your vision, the role of the board in making sure that all what we have been discussing today is actually happening in companies. Please.
Thank you, Ashraf. Thank you, Hakama, for the invitation. And, our panel is how boards should monitor ESG. But instead, I would prefer to start and to kick off saying why boards should care about ESG. We heard today from first regulators, and I remember here the words of Dr. Mariam saying that ESG is non-negotiable, and it's only a matter of the speed you want to adopt good practice in regards to environment, social, and governance. We heard from investors that they are really doing their role in being stewards on the capital they allocate in regards to boards, engaging with boards, and looking for how companies and how boards are monitoring ESG factors. So this would be already two very important reasons why boards should care and pay attention to environment, social, and governance elements. But on top of that, I would like to bring another perspective, which is not only the perception of regulators and investors, but also the intrinsic value of doing so. And what I'm talking about here, I mean, of course, we know the climate emergency facing us. We know about the social challenges the world is facing in many different geographies around the world. But also, let's take only one factor to consider here. And I'm talking about, for instance, millennials, a portion of a demographic portion in the world. I learned from a study that in 2030, 75% of the global workforce will be composed by millennials. And also they will respond for $30 trillion in global wealth in some decades. We know that millennials around the world are more interested in understanding the environment and social pressures that we are living, so they care about it. So they try to buy products of companies that are aware and doing their role. So if a company wants to retain employees, attract talent, buy products to consumers, on top of attracting investors, companies should be looking very carefully to the impact of their activities on environment and population around them, and social, for instance, social factors. And governance works for me as the driving force of the E and S components of ESG. When you do not have good governance in place, it's very difficult to consider that you're going to have real, actual practice of related to the impacts of environment and social of firms' activities. So, on top of being compliant with regulation, on top of having a good relationship with sources of capital, so the incentive of reducing the cost of capital, on top of all that, if you really want to create value through time, what I call the intrinsic value, you should, as a board director, take a very good attention to how your company is dealing with the impacts on environment and social. And this is about retaining people. This is about creating a reputation that is an intangible capital of the company. So that's the idea of considering why boards should do. How boards should do this, it's another thing, and we are going to have lots of time to cover this. I would only touch in this, setting the scene, that it all should start with defining the purpose of the company. Okay. And from that, we can build all the framework that a company should consider to pursue in this regard. I'm going to stop here because I think we want a discussion with my dear colleagues on this panel.
Colin, from your point of view, what is generally the role of the board in sustainability and ESG? I mean, who is driving in companies, and what should boards be doing there?
Well, I think ultimately every action. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Ashraf and Hokama for the invite. It's wonderful to be with all of you today. I'm here in Singapore, and to all the participants in Dubai, a very good afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you. I know definitely the board is the ultimate accountability, has ultimate accountability for the actions, policies, and results of any company that they're responsible for. So it is very critical that the board always take that first and foremost step. And Sandra talks about the compliance and legislative impact of ESG. I certainly agree with that, because take for example the most multinational corporates that are based on the Delaware Corporation, for example. And that rule actually is quite generic and quite applicable across whether you have companies in the US, Europe, Middle East, or Asia. For example, the duty of loyalty. The duty of loyalty, for instance, is about the fact that at the end of the day, the board is responsible for the long-term interests and sustainability, and making sure that the actions of the company is in good hands. And under and on top of that, you have the a number of actions that the board is responsible for also under the Delaware Corporation. It is called duty of oversight. The duty of oversight means the ability of boards in ensuring policies are in place, monitoring systems are enacted, whether through the board and through the actions of the management team. They are designed to allow management and the board to reach informed judgment on the actions of the company. And thirdly, the duty of care is that the directors have a legal obligation within the stock exchange to make lawful and informed decisions. So you've got to have that. The duty is about the robustness of the process, the information, the actions, and the process and procedures within the company. So these are the duties and obligations of the board directors, which is first and foremost. And Sandra talked earlier also about the objectives of the company. What does the company exist to do? What kind of services, and what's the mission of the organization? And ultimately, the board is responsible for the long-term sustainability of the organization. So that's my view, Dr. Ashraf.
Thank you, Colin. Karina, now you are an experienced board member, and you have been promoting a lot the idea of sustainability in different companies. Now, my question to you is if a board is a company new in the area of sustainability, so the board would like to start thinking about this. I mean, where do we start? Where does the board start to have sustainability in their company? I mean, this applies to this part of the world where still it's a new concept and companies are still thinking what to do there. So where do you start?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for having me today, Dr. Ashraf and Hokama. And thank you to Sandra and Colin, because you've really laid the groundwork for me to then jump into the, the difficult part. And that is, ESG, there's a reason why it's not called compliance, right? It's the very essence of ESG is to identify those areas where companies need to do things differently and better from what the law and the regulatory framework require them to do. And that immediately raises interesting conundrums in respect of the points that Colin just made, because, and I've experienced this with colleagues on my own board and with fellow directors in other companies, when grappling, for example, but not only, but for example, with the challenge of climate change, which is so extensive and so extreme that it calls on us to think about the business model and about major capital investment decisions in a way that could conceivably, in fact, often requires us to take significant risks, leave short-term business opportunities on the table because of a judgment that we may reach that over the longer term, this is bad business, this exposes us to the risk of stranding, and therefore raises, and I have this objection from several directors, if we do this, we're going to be in breach of our fiduciary obligations as directors to maximize shareholder returns. And so there's this kind of friction between where boards have always thought they needed to be versus where they have to go in the face of some very unpredictable and unprecedented challenges. So that, by way of introduction to your question, if you're starting out on this journey, you're jumping into level 4.0 of a problem. You're not thinking about how do I make sure that my health and safety is in line with global best practice? How do I make sure that my anti-corruption framework is in line with global best practice, or that my employee engagement or my human rights practices are in line with global best practice? You need to do all of those things, but you also need to think in terms of survival. And if we think about where we are today, this very day, in the middle of COP27, happening just across the straits in Sharm el-Sheikh, hosted by a major oil and gas producer, my own company, is the largest gas producer in that country. What sorts of challenges does that raise for directors when business as usual for us, which by the way is going very well with the current price of gas, what should we in our boardrooms be doing and thinking differently to think about where the world will be in 20 and 30 years? Because the investments that we're making today as we chase after replacement supplies of gas are locking us in until the 2050s. And will those investments still be viable at that time? So to answer your question, Dr. Ashraf, boards have a harder job than they did before because they need to think with a lens that is much further out into the future, where the level of predictability is even lower than it always was. I mean, we always knew we were operating with imperfect visibility into the future. This is worse than before. And yet it is our legal responsibility to do so. Failure to do so is a failure in fulfilling our duties. So I think any board that is confronted with these types of challenges needs to take a deep breath and say, where are we today in relation to the range of challenges that my company faces in respect of climate change, in respect of the more operational issues of human rights and corruption and community engagement and so forth, in respect of pandemic risk, in respect of global trends that are, that can potentially both pose a risk to our business, but also open up unprecedented opportunities. And where do we want to position ourselves in respect of those challenges and threats?
Okay, thank you. Sandra, I want to ask you, what kind of practical lessons and experience we can get from companies which have done good or done bad in this area of, as Karina was talking about, the responsibility of the board and having this long-term vision? I mean, do we have any practical lessons for other companies to learn from, failures or successes in this case?
Yes, certainly. I think that we could start with the success one. And I was talking that the departure point could be, a good departure point could be the definition of the purpose of the company. And this is not a rhetorical exercise. It's an exercise of putting together board and management and involving a very big group of employees of the company on defining what is the purpose of this company beyond reaching economic value. Of course, economic value is there, and economic value should be there because you have to finance all the other activities of the company. But what is on top of that? What is beyond that? And why this is important? Because it's precisely the purpose that put together the internal actors of the company, employees, management, board, but also the external ones, suppliers, government, investors. So when you have all driven by the purpose, it's much easier to communicate the goals of the company and to involve all the stakeholders towards that goal. When you have the purpose, then you can pursue an analysis on materiality, and we've been talking today on different approaches to materiality. And then you're going to reach the indicators that the company will pursue in this regard. You have frameworks around the world. Karina has been working in a very good framework to orient boards on how to approach ESG and particularly climate. So I think this is a very valuable exercise, and it's much different of only taking the compliance approach. As she said, otherwise we would be calling this compliance. And this is not about compliance, or at least what I'm proposing here, it's a value creation exercise to adhere to ESG factors, not only the compliance perspective. The bad examples are the ones that companies are pursuing ESG as a means to only, get a reputation on that. So this could be related to a greenwashing exercise. And this, I think it's more dangerous than not doing anything, because you promise and you do not really deliver. And you not get the real value that I'm talking about, the value of putting together all stakeholders towards a certain objective of the company. This is really sustainable and valuable. So the good approach by another approach that I think it's not only valuable, but it's dangerous.
Now, other panelists, can we have any examples or lessons learned from other examples, good or bad, in the area of boards taking sustainability forward or not taking it forward? Can you give us examples, please, and lessons learned? Karina?
Dr. Ashraf, if I could give an example of a specific example, of how we actually shifted to this ESG process from one of the companies that I sit on the board on, which is AET Tankers. Unlike Karina, which is at E&I, which is upstream, I'm on the downstream side, where we actually provide logistics. We actually lease ships on a long-term basis, 15, 20 years. And these could be ranged from mid-sized tankers. And these are businesses, oil and gas. We're in the oil and gas space, which is very much in where a lot of the participants today are in. And what we have done actually in the last 3 years is to start embark on an exercise of defining, as Sandra says, what kind of business are we in? How do we benchmark ourselves to be the top 3 in the world? And I believe that we're right now, in the last 3 years, we are one of the key petroleum tanker lessors in the world, with a worldwide fleet, with BP, Shell, Total, Equinor as an example. And we're doing a lot of these things where a year or two ago, we were benchmarking and deciding if we were to continue our business model as this, and knowing, for example, that we cannot continue to operate in a very dirty environment where our ships are generating 20 to 30% greenhouse gases than before. And this is how we have actually benchmarked that by 2030, 2040, 2050, there are progressions in place. We have changed the entire fleet, for example, which are built in Japan and Korea. Yeah. And we are still receiving ships as we speak in this current times, which is actually a great thing, right? Because there's a huge shortage of petroleum tankers in the world. Our investments right now could not be more opportune. And we're receiving ships. This year alone, we've received 6 tankers, and we've deployed them. We're receiving another 6 more tankers next year. And despite, and we're in a wonderful cycle, simply because when you look at any asset class you're in right now, 30 to 40% increases for new assets. So these were orders that were made in the last 2 years. So on top of that, these ships are generating 20 to 30%. They use the dual fuel. They use LNG, for example, which is a much cleaner fuel than bunker fuel. And along with that, there are a number of things that we're doing. For example, ships that are no longer out, that will be out of the fleet, we will actually send them to shipyards that will dispose of them, and not send them to, for example, places like in northwestern India, where a lot of the ships have just been moored and banked down to the seas, and a lot of toxic gases are been done. So it's a responsibility to the environment as well, and also Anti-Slavery Act that we strictly adhere to. So these are things that, as a corporate culture, we've literally enforced. It's not just commercial, but as Sandra mentioned, defining who we are and what we want to be 10 years from now. And we also know that at the same time, we've got to do a strategic pivot. This ESG model is depending on whatever model you use, the GRI or the TCFD. In our case, we use the TCFD modeling, for instance. and really guides us through a very comprehensive process about our strategy, about our metrics, and how we're going to drive down greenhouse emissions. So it's methodical, it's well thought out, and it's even thinks about the fact that by the end of the late 2030s, depending on which side of the economists or geographers that define that the end of crude oil, for example. So we are also at the same time thinking about pivoting our business to greener businesses, whether it's renewables or even the ability to go into green businesses. So two things are happening all at the same time. We're moving into a new direction, at the same time, also making sure that we are recouping our investments from this current business model. That's what I want to share, Dr. Ashraf, in terms of what we do.
Thank you. Karine, do you want to add anything to this? Please.
Sure. I'll take the example of Eni, otherwise known as ENI. And going back to Sandra's point, the first question you ask yourself is, what business are you in? And we used to define ourselves as an oil and gas company. And 8 years ago when I joined the board, we began a discussion about what it was we actually were. If you think about it, people don't actually care whether what they get from us comes from a barrel or an electron. What they want and what we provide is heating and cooling and lighting and mobility and power. So we need to continue to provide those things. And in fact, we exist in a world where I think it's around 900 million people don't even have access to the basics, right? And we don't want to be in a dynamic where in order to deal with the climate crisis, we are depriving people who don't have access to energy to that access. So, so we define our corporate mission as delivering access to energy, but it needs to be sustainable, i.e. zero carbon, and affordable. And how do we get there? Well, when you are operating a gigantic supertanker, as we do, it's not something that you can do overnight, but you need to sort of plot your journey. And in our case, it starts with, given that we have a bunch of physicists and chemists and other scientists on board, recognizing that we collectively as a species, as a planet, have a given carbon budget, and we as Eni have to exist within the limits of our carbon budget, which has to shrink every year to get to zero by 2050, hopefully even earlier. And so how do we do that? It starts with an acknowledgement that our core product is actually the core problem, right? So again, we're not going to switch off the tap instantly because we have obligations to our customers, to our shareholders, and technologically it's not something we can achieve in the blink of an eye. But what we do is we deploy all of our technical capital and our human capital and our financial capital towards investing in a transformation. And in our case, we've determined that that transformation takes the form of investing in a wide range of alternative technologies, solar, wind, hydrogen. We even invest in nuclear fusion, and a variety of other, of course, biofuels. We're very, very big in that. So in order to finance that, I mean, this is part of an integrated strategy. We have to take the core business, the legacy business, and instead of investing for continued growth over an indefinite period, it's about growth over a definite, as in a limited period, a time-limited period, where the emphasis is on near-field extensions, very high return, low risk, rapid payback projects that generate maximum cash, which is split three ways. One, paying investors, keeping them happy, keeping them on side with dividends and buybacks that keep us competitive with rivals. Two, investing in the green investments, which are extremely capital hungry because we want to grow that very, very quickly, increasing our installed capacity in renewables increasing our capacity in biorefining, expanding vertically to secure feedstock of oilseeds, in our case, that do not compete with food, because when you grow the biofuel business, you immediately bump up against a supply issue. There's inadequate supply of sustainable feedstocks. So we have gone out there to create new feedstocks. We've become, in fact, an agricultural company, and we partner with agricultural cooperatives in various 8 African countries to produce oilseeds. And the third area where this cash goes is to reinvest in the upstream business, just enough to keep it ticking over to sustain the transformation of the business. And so if you look at those 3 buckets together, keeping the investors happy, investing in the green stuff at a pace that is delivering outputs of clean energy, and also keeping investors happy because they want to see results. And also the third bucket being making sure that the integrity of the upstream business is preserved so that it's continuing to generate that needed capital. That's the model of transformation of the business. We can't, as I said, we can't just shut down. I mean, some of our peers have made the decision, and I think it's an entirely valid one, that they do not possess the skill sets to embark on a completely new business. It's a big risk. Investors may not back them in that choice. And so for them, the choice is basically to coast to eventual closure. That is also a perfectly valid strategy, so long as others out there are also producing replacement supplies of energy, because the world needs energy. What we can't have, though, and unfortunately there are a lot of producers out there, we cannot have people who just continue business as usual, producing and increasing production with no regard whatsoever for the fact that in doing so, we are creating an ecosystem in which we cannot, as a species, and by the way, as business people, survive and continue to deliver wealth to our shareholders and stakeholders. So we have to acknowledge that the environment in which we operate is deeply compromised, and we need to change who we are in order to protect that environment and continue to thrive as businesses and, by the way, as a species. So that is, I think, the most ambitious example that I personally have participated in a board where we started with something that was, fundamentally unsustainable. I mean, you could say that it was operationally aligned with best practice, but we were marching towards, extinction. We were the world's best producer of buggy whips, and buggy whips are not a viable business anymore, nor are Polaroid cameras, and we didn't want to go down that route. So we're taking the skills we have to become something different.
Thank you. Now, Sandra, one of, in the first session we discussed regulations and sustainability. Now, in some cases you might operate or be a board member in a company where regulations don't really focus that much on most of these area of sustainability, environment, and social, and so on. And it might be challenging that you talk to the investors, the shareholders, and trying to convince them of lots of things which might cost them money or profits while regulations are not asking for this. I mean, how can you handle situations, if you are a board member in a company where regulation does not require any of that stuff, how can you handle this, or requires the minimum, if you like?
To handle the pressure of investors?
Yeah, I mean, how can you really go on the sustainability route if the regulations are not requiring to do that, and the shareholders might not be really that much interested in sustainability anyways?
There is, in a certain degree, the market is evolving in all geographies. So you're going to find very mature models, as we heard from the investors before, where investors are engaging, regulators are, looking for practice in companies, and there are other regions where this is just starting. So certain regions are in the awareness phase. And in other markets, you are in much more mature phases where, as Paul Lee was saying, if I'm not wrong, he say, you cannot ask companies in more mature markets that you would ask for more mature markets the same practices for regions where this is just kicking off. So, but I think that it's important that to consider that this is not driven only to access capital, or even as Karina was saying, making investors happy, because there are certain places where the cost of capital is not a so pressure issue as in others. So in many jurisdictions, family-owned, controlling owners are very happy with the cost of their capital, and capital is not an issue. But in this situation, and talking about family-owned groups, family-owned companies, where you don't have an issue with capital, I think it's rare, but it exists. But you have to be concerned in regards to the future of this wealth creation for the family purposes. There will be a second, third, fourth generation to come, and you have to provide wealth to the generations coming. So you want your business to endure through time. And for that, you have to be open to the transformation of your business, as Karina was mentioning, not only because it's a good citizenship to do, but because you have to be, valuable throughout the years. So I think that there are many drivers to the boards to be alert about, and the pressure of regulators, the pressure for investors, but there is the pressure from, within the family groups, within the company, how you're going to survive to new business coming on. I mean, let's consider even startups and scale-ups, very modern and new ones, now are being in positions to be incumbent business, being challenged by new startups and scale-ups. So it's tough being in the business life recently. So you have to be always open to innovation to transform the business. So transform because of new business models are showing up, or because you have pressures like climate, for instance. You may say, no, I'm in a business that is not, my business is not affected too much by climate. Okay, and what about in the near future? What will be the impact of climate in your business? But not only in your business, in your employees, in your suppliers, and so on. So I don't think this is a matter of if you do, it's a matter of when you do. And I would say you should hurry up, because time is of the essence.
Colin, I wanted to ask you, what kind of technologies are we investing in, or companies investing in, and how is this affecting sustainability? Because people think that technology is okay, it's good. When you invest in technology, this is good for sustainability and so on. That's the assumption. Can you tell us, please, your experience in this?
Great question, Dr. Ashraf. Karina and I in one of the dirtiest industries, which is oil and gas, and especially for me, being in the maritime side of it, where we ship oil all over the world. And for the last 200 years, think about this. All ships have been using, we started out with steamships traversing the oceans, and now we use modern technology, and even with modern technology, we use bunker fuel, which is really, the worst and dirtiest fuel in the world to power the ships. So what we've done 3 years ago is to really, when we look at, we know we cannot continue the model as is in terms of our sustainability, in terms of our operating. If we really want to be the top 3 companies in the world, we've got to do a lot better in terms of our focus on the environment. And this is where we did two things. And I mentioned earlier about the fleet renewal, but the fleet renewal is not simply buying new ships. It is simply, the game changer is really into dual fuel, where the ability of using bunker fuel and LNG gas. LNG gas is a transition fuel. It is one of the cleanest fuel that's available right now. And so we have ships that uses two types of fuel at the same time. So the ability to reduce emissions, and we have the ability to compute and actually know exactly how much greenhouse gases we emit. But the second technology area, it is really transformational, and I think I was really excited being part of this. When we were going through this in the strategy review a year ago, we were looking at ammonia. Ammonia is a fuel that if you're able to use this on a ship, it has zero carbon. Think about this. If we can have ships that has zero carbon emitting capacity, we can operate a ship anywhere in the world with zero carbon. And that's exactly what we did. And we just made an announcement this year that we're going to invest in 2 ships using ammonia as a fuel. And frankly, even as a multi-billion-dollar company, we can't do this alone. And we did this with a number of technology, not only technology partners, but also governments. In this case, we were partnering with Lloyd's in London. We provide the cognitive and the ability to strategize on fuel. Lloyd's Register out of London, for example. And we also partnered with the Singapore government, the Maritime Patrol Authority, because you can't just invest in the ships. You got to have an infrastructure. The infrastructure is multi-billion dollars of infrastructure in terms of refueling ammonia. And not only that, if we were to use ammonia, think of this. If we had just a slight leakage, this entire room that we're having this conference in, everyone will be down and we will have a fatal incident within 1 minute, because ammonia is toxic at the same time. But we have the technology, and and not only that, the ammonia is green itself. It's from a company out of headquartered out in Australia, and Australia has green ammonia. They have the capacity to produce, because of the amount of renewable energy there, the ability to produce green energy. So throughout the spectrum, this is going to be revolutionary, Dr. Ashraf. An ammonia-powered ship on a VLCC class. This 1 million to 2 million barrels per day that these ships can literally ferry. And on top of that, when we launched this back in June, we now have a customer, PTT of Thailand. PTT Thailand, they came in and they wanted the same technology but for mid-sized tankers, because they operate in the Gulf and the South China Sea area. So we are, this will have the ability now to launch 4 ships. And we will have a European partner to be announced soon in Europe, because you can't operate the ship from Singapore and then on to the Middle East, but ultimately to Europe. So these will be the transshipment point between Europe and Asia, where the ability to transport petroleum on a zero carbon basis. We're talking this ship is going to arrive in 3 years' time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is revolutionary. And we're going to have to test this technology on the basis that when it's successful, this can be spread across fleet globally. There's about 100,000 ships in the world. And every year, about 10% of these ships have to be replaced. Just imagine that we will, when this ship, 2 to 3 years from now, when this launch, and when we're successful, we will be able to speed the implementation of this zero carbon fuel, zero carbon vessels. Another technology in which we're investing with Shell and Trafalgar, it's a Swiss company. And of course, all of you in this room know about methane slip, CH4. When you use LNG, there is definitely in the distribution, in the refueling, and even on the ship, there'll be gases, methane gases that will be emitted by the ships. And methane is 28 to 30 times more harmful than carbon dioxide. So this is an area that we focus and attack on. And we actually invested in this space with this Swiss company. And it's going to be proved. This technology is going to be proved in the next 1 to 2 years. And the machinery that's going to be deployed on all new ships will be such that it's able to minimize methane to less than 1%. It's significantly impactful. So it's a whole series of technologies, and also we invest in venture capital companies, and the venture companies are in, for example, IoT technology, the ability to censor and use artificial data, artificial intelligence and data analytics to analyze the ship operating parameters, emissions, and when this is all put together, Dr. Ashraf, it'll be such a powerful tool, and it'll be very impactful on the maritime industry. This is going to be revolutionary. This will be revolutionary. So it's an exciting space that I've been part of together with my board on this, and we totally support this arena. It's really exciting.
Karina, I'd like to get back to you on something that you mentioned a few minutes ago. With the COP27 and COP28 next year, inshallah, are held in a region where it is, economies are mostly oil, despite of diversification efforts. Still, a lot of countries, 90%, 80% of revenues coming around oil and gas and so on. What would be the responsibilities of the boards in a region like this? What would be the recommendations for them? I mean, that's the economy, that's what you have. This is actually the resource that you have. What is it that you can do then? Please.
Thank you for that question. I mean, I think the region, a country in the region hosting COP28 is immensely significant for exactly the reasons you say. But I do think that the company in which I operate is really a microcosm of those same challenges. In fact, probably even more acute, because 100% of the business until recently was dependent on fossil fuels. So how do the region unfortunately does not get to escape the global climate challenge. It happens to be very fortunate that it's sitting on the most abundant and cheapest and easiest to access resources in the world, which means that in the hierarchy of assets that will continue to operate until such time as they have to stop, this is the region that's going to be the winner. The challenge is that if you talk to just about everybody in the industry, everyone believes that they will be the last one standing, that they are, Canadian, I'm Canadian, so I'm going to say this, Canadian operators will tell you that they have the best, cleanest oil, even though it comes from oil sands, because it doesn't have human rights abuses, right? Or because it's operating according to the very cleanest environmental operating practices, even though the well-to-wheel footprint is extremely large. So we need to get, first of all, past this misapprehension of where the different resources stand and which ones are going to be the last ones standing. And clearly, the Middle East is the winner on this one. But it doesn't mean that it's a permanent asset. It's an asset that also is going to be taken out of service. And so it behooves the industry, it behooves the region, just as we are doing in Eni, and I know that some of our peers are doing the same, to use the resources that we generate today, the wealth that we generate today from an asset that needs to be ultimately sunset to finance the industries of tomorrow. And we're seeing that already in the Gulf. We're seeing major investments in diversification, not just in non-energy industries, which of course is necessary in property and real estate and finance and agriculture and so forth, but also in energy that will replace the energy that is being produced today. And again, the Gulf happens to be quite fortunate that it's also sitting on some of the best natural, as in renewable energy resources in the world. So the prospects for affecting that transition, that transformation into new industries are good. It doesn't mean that it has to go back to the Stone Age, right? But it needs to be planned today, and it needs to be managed in a very, kind of with intentional way, with the recognition that the clock is ticking, and that this is a gift that the region is sitting on that needs to be used wisely to fund the transformation and long-term sustainability of the region for the benefit of its people.
Thank you. Now, a question for the three of you, actually, starting with you, Sandra. Do you feel, because you are all three experienced board members in so many different types of organizations and companies, do you feel that board members have enough knowledge and awareness of all these issues we are discussing right now? And, do we need to think about education for boards? And what is the status of boards? Are they all advanced in a way to handle what kind of challenges we are talking about? Sandra?
Well, Ashraf, an honest answer would be no. And I think my colleagues, Karina and Colin, will agree. Of course, throughout the boards, you have different people with lots of knowledge on that. But we are talking about an average here around the world. I think that even companies where there is a good awareness and understanding of the ESG factors and needs, I see, at least in my region, Latin America and Brazil, I see many boards delegating to management the understanding of all, Colin was talking about TCFD, GRI. They may eventually think that it's too operational for a board director to tackle. And this is an issue. I think that today, a board director is being challenged every single day. I mean, changes facing us all the time, every day. Crises, risks are a permanent thing. I'm going to use a very used expression that I don't like, but it's the new normal of a board director, living in constant challenging mode. So all the directors, even the more senior, experienced, and knowledgeable in all the aspects, including ESG, have to update themselves constantly. I try to do so. I mean, every year I try to do, and I have chosen to focus my attention recently on two specific approaches that I find interesting as the perspective of a board director. ESG. I recently got an accreditation on ESG for board directors. And second, innovation. So every single year I try to do a program, normally abroad, on what is challenging boards in regards to innovation, technology, and I'm not talking about only IT, I'm talking about automation of business and everything. I mean, Colin was so excited talking about the technologies that will transform the business, the extraction business as we know it, and not oil and gas, mining and everything. So also the pursuit of good environment and social practices in a company comes from the use of technology. For instance, in mining, you have certain minerals that are transitioning minerals to, the transition energy that is necessary. So I would say board directors, although as knowledgeable as they can be, it's a life learning process. And you have to increase your study, every single day to try to learn things, to make a program. And of course, Hakama has these important programs on training board of directors and board secretaries, which is very, very useful. And on top of that, another thing that was mentioned today was board evaluation, because with the board evaluation process, you may understand the better matrix composition for your board. And this will highlight the competencies that you have to bring on board to face new realities and the new challenges that your business is facing. And for the individual, it's also very valuable because you're going to hear from your peers that eventually you can improve your knowledge in this aspect or in that specific thing. So I would say that learning, training all the time, and understanding what the board evaluation brings to you as a director are 2 points that one board director should pursue.
It's interesting, actually, somebody with your experience and board knowledge. And Sandra, actually, she used to be the head of the Brazilian Corporate Governance Institute, which is the most successful one globally. But she's still talking about education and taking certification after all that experience. So that's really, really quite interesting. I really cherish
and
that.
you were never ready. Yeah. If you were a good learner, you were never ready.
I can't agree more with what Sandra just said, especially when you talk about training and especially on ESG. There's so much going on. Sandra, I can't agree with you more. And it's so critical for our board directors to get themselves trained on, which is something I'm really concerned about. I just want to quote something. I was on the INSEAD University board before. And Heidrick and Struggles, together with INSEAD University, conducted a study last year. And what they found was that 75% of board members said that climate change is very, very important to the strategic success of their companies. But do you realize that at the same time, the study also found that 46% of the board members says that they have insufficient knowledge or no knowledge about climate change implications for financial performance. Now, this is extremely concerning. The only good news is I'm on Diligent board, the Diligent Institute, which provide board books, one of the biggest corporate board books in the world, which is a SaaS software company. And what we found with our own survey in the last 6 months, that ESG now at every board meeting is being discussed this year especially. And as recent as August onwards, board directors are really taking notice. And now boards are really wanting their board directors to be trained in ESG. So there are various kinds of programs, and Sandra has been certified as an ESG. I was also one of the first ESG certified board member by the Diligent Institute, for example. This program only started beginning of this year, and our certification was only in July. And I can't say how important this is. How can you be on the board when you have no understanding of what ESG is all about? It's easy for us to talk about just the 3 alphabets, E, S, and the G. But there are so many things, there's so many concepts, and so many areas of practices, of best practices that you need to be really up to speed on. Singapore, starting on January 1st, is going to start onto a TCFD reporting process. And the only good part is because it's going to be law January 1st, people are going to really take notice. And board directors are really going to get themselves trained on this, which is good. Because it's not just the board, but I think everyone, you yourself, need to get yourself up to speed on this. This is so critical.
Yeah. Karina, I'd like to add something to this discussion.
Yeah, I'm very happy to come after both of you because you leave me the easy part, which is A, to agree, and B, to just add a few things. First of all, Colin, in fact, I'm convinced that if 75% of the respondents in the Heidrick and Struggles survey said that climate change was, a major risk factor for their businesses, and 43% said that they didn't possess the necessary skills, I think that is a gross overstatement of those who implicitly say they do have the necessary skills. I'm sorry, 57% of directors do not. They simply do not. And in fact, one of the other major search firms, I forget which one it was, stood up at a symposium I attended not too long ago. They had conducted a review, and they said 3% did, all right, 3%. So we have a lot of work to do. And I would add this, I mean, I did my entire career in this area through the lens of sustainable investment, right? My career started off in banking and then in asset management, and I quickly pivoted into sustainable investment in the 90s, all right? When I landed on the board of an oil major, by the way, nominated by the investors who wanted somebody with that skill set, I personally, despite having been a practitioner, was overwhelmed with the complexity of what was necessary. I had no idea how to go about incorporating a climate lens into our strategic decision making. And I fumbled around and I spoke to everybody I knew, you know, how do people do this? Is there a guidance book somewhere? There was nothing. This is why Sandra very kindly referenced earlier that I started an initiative to address this gap. This is why I basically sat down with the World Economic Forum. We created something called the Climate Governance Initiative, which is a program to enable board directors to gain the skills that they need in climate change, which sounds like a very specialist area, but it actually encompasses everything from scenarios to risk management, to strategic planning, to remuneration, to human capital, to stakeholder engagement, to biodiversity and water. I mean, when you think about it, climate change is a multifaceted issue that underpins certainly every aspect of board decision-making, but also it cuts across many, many aspects of corporate strategy. And, you know, we're developing a training program, in fact, with Sandra's former organization, IBGC, the Brazilian Institute of Corporate Governance in Brazil, but we're in 50 countries now. And just last week I was in Sharm el-Sheikh to announce the creation of our Egyptian chapter, and we will be launching a UAE chapter well in time for COP28, I hope. I mean, I'm counting on all of you. But the idea is to bring these skills in a way that is accessible and practical and just familiar and usable for directors so that they can go into the boardroom armed with the tools that they need to make a capable, effective argument to their peers to say, all right, guys, this is how it's done. Here's some guidance on audit. Here's some guidance on risk. Here's some guidance on remuneration. This is how scenarios work. And this is how we need to use them in our business so that we can really lift our game and get some accurate statistics, because I'm quite stunned that only 43% of directors admitted to not knowing. I think that tells you something about the self-belief that directors have.
And can I add something that, because you mentioned remuneration, and I think that's crucial to understand if the board is really doing the role that it's expected to do, is when you analyze if the compensation policy and the remuneration program of the company encompasses ESG factors. Because if you don't, I mean, first of all, I don't like to call ESG strategy. I will be very happy when we just simply call strategy. And the strategy embeds ESG, right? So when we get there, we're going to be fine. But I think we are going to get there when we include in the goals of your strategy ESG goals. And this is also included in the remuneration of the executives. To this day, it's very common, and I'm talking internationally and for emerging countries, to have only economic and production elements on the remuneration of the executives. So if you don't use the other intangible value creation that you are intended in your strategy, if you don't include it in remuneration, how can you ensure that the executives are going to follow your objectives, your goals? I mean, climate, reduction of emissions, the healthy conditions of your social network, your conditions of work, diversity in work, all of these elements should be considered in the compensation and the remuneration of the executives. When you see that, you can see that there is a good level of maturity in the specific company dealing with ESG.
I don't want to surprise you, but I'll just tell you one very recent experience. As part of an exercise we are doing right now in Hawkama, I mean, I've personally read at least like 50 or 55 annual reports and sustainability reports of companies in the MENA region, where regulators, they force companies that they have to mention the risks in their annual report, what are the risks they are facing, and how to mitigate that. I can say I couldn't find a single one which mentioned environment as a risk for them, despite you talk about companies in the area of manufacturing, you talk about financial institutions, investment companies, logistics companies, retail businesses, all different types of companies. Apparently still they don't perceive this as a risk. So they have things like they say we plant trees, for example, but they never really mention environment as a risk that's facing them and that might affect even their profitability and business. Despite what we see in the crisis of, commodities, for example, and stuff like that from what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, but they still don't see this as a risk. So that's not translated into their annual reports and their, of course, board discussions at this stage. So we have only a few minutes, actually 2 minutes to go. If somebody has a comment or a question. Okay, people are tired. I know it's been a long day. So would the panelists would like to say a final word before we leave, or you feel okay like this? Everything is fine, please? Karina?
I have a final word, if I may. And it goes back to, I think, a point that Sandra made earlier on about how regulation and policy are not always consistent. In fact, by definition, they're not where they need to be. There's always a time lag between what ought to be happening and where regulation is. And, what should we as directors then do? Should we respond to the way the policy signals, require us to behave today, or should we be anticipating where they ought to go and therefore perhaps are likely to go? Will they or won't they move in the direction that they should? And I'm thinking in particular in the case of climate change. Now, fast forward to what's happened in the United States, where around a dozen years ago, there was a big push in the private equity industry to put literally billions of dollars into packages of coal-fired power plants, because it was very profitable and there was an opportunity. What's happening now with the new legislation in the United States? These plants they need to be taken out of service, but investors are sitting on billions of investments that are stranded. And there's an argument about who should pick up the tab for basically writing down those assets, and taking the loss. And, if we were in Vietnam or in Mozambique, we might say, well, it's the responsibility of the taxpayer or the international taxpayer to subsidize this transition. If we're sitting in Iowa or Idaho or any of these places where these coal-fired power plants are located, my only question is, what were the boards thinking a dozen years ago when they were authorizing the deployment of this capital? Everybody knew about the science of climate change, and yet everybody persisted in thinking that policy would not catch up fast enough, and there was a nice big long window in which we could continue to make very good returns. Well, that bet has proven wrong, and we need to think of ourselves now today in the boardroom, asking ourselves, which bets are we taking today that are going to be proven wrong because we believed that policy would not catch up with science. And should we then be a step ahead of policy and protect our business, make it resilient, give ourselves exit options so that we don't sit on multi-billion-dollar losses because of decisions that were made at a time when it looked like the right thing to do. So I want to leave you with that thinking because, I mean, every day of the week, I ask myself that question.
Great statement, thank you. Colin, would you like to add something, please? Yeah.
I want to leave with this thought for the conference. I just learned a new word this week called climate doomism. Climate doomism is about the psychology that, we're way beyond, we're on our way to hell because of this inability to manage our greenhouse gases emission. But what I'm really excited about is the fact that I see a lot of hope in that we've got people like you and I, sitting on boards, and we've got the responsibility to make a change, the responsibility to make an impact on the world, and in whatever industry you're in. I mean, as I mentioned about my early example about my board, about what we did, because if we're able to get this technology working, this is going to be revolutionary since Industrial Revolution to emit zero, to have zero emission vehicles. So I think that all of us have that responsibility, the responsibility of creating a legacy, of creating a much better world with zero emissions by 2050. Mm-hmm. So with that, I pass it back to you, Dr. Ashraf.
Thank you, Colin.
Well, on top of what my panel colleagues mentioned, and I think that I would like to invite all board directors that are listening to us today, that our panel is how boards could monitor ESG implementation, right? But I invite you all to think as how can you as a board director can be a source of inspiration for management and the whole firm towards this transformation that Colin was mentioned. We have the responsibility to make the change. In boards, we are, in the top of the decision-making process. We can monitor, we have many responsibilities, but I think on top of that, beyond that, we can be a source of inspiration towards this path of a better world that we really can transform. And to transform, you really need to, first of all, have a vision that you, the board, the company, the management can really embrace this transformation of the world to provide a better world and a better society. So I invite all board directors to also be a source of inspiration for a better world through better companies.
Thank you so much. I mean, that was really excellent closure for the session. I'd like to thank the panelists for their time and their valuable contributions. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I can invite Chris Hodge and YT Mac to the stage for a quick recap of the day, and then we can go home. Thank you for staying with us.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I'll go to Hi, it's great to see the brave souls that are still here. Okay, Chris and I are supposed to close. It's kind of like you go to a concert, right? You have an opening act and a main act. I'm kind of the opening act to the closing act. Okay, so I'm just going to reflect on a few things, but not, the moderators have kind of summarized the sessions pretty well. But I want to kind of talk about three main points from my perspective in terms of governance and sustainability. One is the better integration of stakeholder interests into and sustainability considerations into corporate governance code. So I'm kind of reflecting on, you know, when I was in Singapore sitting on the first corporate governance committee, that was way back in 2000. And one of the first questions we discussed was, should we follow the shareholder or the stakeholder model? We said, let's follow the shareholder model. And of course, we did talk about stakeholder interests, but all the principles and the guidelines were written with shareholder protection and shareholder value creation in mind. So you look at the whole code, essentially it's just lip service to stakeholders' interests. You know, and I think that's the same in a number of other markets, in Asia, for example. Fast forward the global financial crisis, when the codes were reviewed again around the region, you see a little bit more emphasis on stakeholders' interests. And I was in the last committee that reviewed the code again. In 2018, they released the code again. We then had a separate section, new section on stakeholders' interests, okay, and new principles and guidelines. But my view is that that's not enough. You know, my view is that the whole corporate governance code should be relooked at from the board, from remuneration, risk management, internal audit, everything. And sustainability considerations and stakeholders' interests should be weaved better into corporate governance codes. That's my first point. My second point is really about, you know, there's some, you know, comment about the fact that a lot of today, when we are looking at sustainability reporting standards, basically, if you look at the major standards, it talks about having to disclose the governance bodies that are responsible for overseeing and the management bodies that are supposed to be responsible for managing sustainability risks and opportunities. But as I think one of the session commented earlier, it is kind of left to companies in terms of what kind of sustainability governance structures and management practices that they put in place, pretty much left up to them. And I think just now in the previous panel, what is the role of the board in ESG? I think one of the roles of the board in ESG is to make sure you have the appropriate sustainability governance and management structures in place. You know, is the whole board responsible for sustainability? Do you put it, I see some companies putting it within the risk committee, some put it in the audit committee, some say we set up a separate board sustainability committee. Some say it's a board sustainability committee together with other committees. I think boards need to think about what is appropriate for them and what kind of management bodies ought to be involved. And you think about your 3 lines, we talk about 3 lines of defense, I think you need to think about those. You know, what are the attributes you want in your chief sustainability officer for your business? You know, so that's my second point. But related to that, also the point that was, I think, was emphasized, I think Sandra may have made that point, which is, you know, the materiality assessment, or what is most important, right, for your company. I think that's extremely important to get that materiality assessment right, because it drives everything else. You know, the SASB standards give you some guidance because it talks about for a certain industry subsector, these are the key things. But for every company, there are unique ESG factors that you faced. But in order to do all that right, I think you need the right people. So we come back to the board, having the right people. And just now, there was some talk about board skills and competencies. You know, a few days ago, I posted on LinkedIn about this top 50 market cap Australian listed company, and they kind of posted in their annual report, they kind of listed 10 skill sets that they think the board needs, including sustainability, cybersecurity, and all that. So they rated how many of the 9 directors have each of the skill set. You know, most of them were 9 out of 9. So basically, out of the 10 skills, they said, most of them, they said 9 out of the 9 directors have that skill set, including cybersecurity, sustainability, governance. All the directors think they know governance, you know? And the minimum was 7, you know? When I look at that, I posted on LinkedIn, seriously, this board is overrating itself, you know? So I think getting the right people and getting an honest assessment, okay, of the board is very important. The last point I want to make is about greenwashing. Because I think that's a big risk, greenwashing. We have seen some examples of greenwashing problems. I'll cite you a couple of examples from where I come from. So we had a company, which is a glove manufacturer, a Malaysian company that's listed in Malaysia and Singapore, and of course they were singled out for forced labor practices. So that was the first ESG scandal that hit them. Okay, and not long after, an NGO basically said that they were misreporting their Scope 3 emissions. They probably didn't need to report Scope 3 emissions, but the fact that they reported Scope 3 emissions exposed it, and they were criticized by the NGO. And I want to point out that the sustainability report, including these indicators, were subject to a limited independence assurance. So even though they had limited independence assurance, they were accused of greenwashing. Okay? But a few days ago, there was a big example, a Singapore government-linked company. And it's all over the news. You know, you go and read Bloomberg, Financial Times, Reuters. Okay, the company is mentioned. So what this company did, it had 2 coal-fired plants in India. It sold off to a group of investors in Oman. Okay, and the way they structured the deal was they had a deferred payment note for 15 years, extendable to up to 24 years. And after 24 years, they can waive all the payments. Okay, and they had a technical advisory agreement. Under the agreement, they provide support, technical advice, and basically they still have operational influence and basically retain most of the liabilities. The employees were all exactly the same. Okay, and why did they do that? Because as a result of flogging those assets off, kind of flogging in quotes, they were able to reduce their GHG intensity rate by 38%. And by doing that, they were able to avoid a 25% basis point increase, okay, in the interest rate for their sustainability-linked bonds. Okay, a company and everybody is now saying that they are greenwashing. Okay, this company, from now on, I think everything it does will be subject to close scrutiny because it's just been called out. And I was quoted in Financial Times. I said, this is financial engineering. Actually, it's not financial. It's almost like emission engineering. Okay. So with that, I'll let Chris take over. I don't know whether he's going to sing for you. You know, to. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Whitey. Thanks, everyone. Sandra said you are never ready, and I'm now determined to prove her right. So just a couple of general observations on what we've heard today. And the first is the difference between governance and ESG, I think, in terms of some of the implications, because normally we get together and talk about governance, and that's complicated enough, and there are many different dimensions to that. But I think compared to ESG, governance is almost quite straightforward and simple. And I think for me, perhaps the key difference is governance is there to support the strategy and the business model and the performance of the company. If you look at ESG and sustainability in the round, that actually drives the strategy and the business model increasingly, or certainly should be. Governance continues to support that. So I think in terms of both the implications for companies and for regional and national economies, it's much more significant. It's, I think, a lot more complicated as well. We've heard in the last session and some of the things Whitey have just been talking about, identifying materiality, the complexity of integrating it into board-level activities and policies. Speaking to people who try to do this at an operational level in companies, they say operationally it's, again, much more complex than governance is, and as I say, governance can be complex enough. I think it was Christina who said that in terms of investor stewardship, it's every part of the organisation needs to be involved in doing that, and certainly from what I hear from people who are trying to implement ESG policies in companies, the same applies there. So in many respects, it's a much more complex thing, as well as having much more wide-reaching implications. The other issues, perhaps picking up on some of the other sessions, are, from a board perspective, is you can't assume that the things that you consider material will necessarily be the same ones that are on the agenda for investors. What we spoke to from there, we didn't really get into the topic, or didn't have time to get into the topic of what their individual priorities were, but I was speaking to the company secretary of one of the largest listed companies in the UK last week, and they said that for those investors who do want to engage with them on sustainability issues, everybody talks about climate. But after that, everybody has a different social or environmental issue that they consider to be their priority, whether that's driven by the makeup of their portfolio, whether it's driven by their clients' preferences. And I think it was, Sandra, you were talking about Generation Z and how that will change the way investors think about these issues. So the company's being bombarded by a number of different priorities that they need to try and manage and engage with. And for regulators, as we heard in the first session, they'll be thinking about things that are important to the national or the regional or the global economy as much as they will, which may match with your company or may not. So boards need to be thinking not just about what's material for you, but also trying to keep up with global developments, engaging with shareholders to understand where they're coming from as well. And as was said, entering into a dialogue to try to, at the very least, manage those expectations. I think the other thing that follows on from that the only other real point I had was that there's a huge amount of uncertainty at the moment, and it seems to apply to all bits of the ecosystem. Stephen mentioned, I think, the three main bodies: regulators and standard setters, boards and investors at the beginning, and I think all of them are currently learning on the job still. I won't repeat what we've been hearing about boards. Investors, I've recently done some work with the International Corporate Governance Network, which George, who chaired the first session, works with, about how investors integrate ESG and sustainability into their mandates and so on. And some, like the ones we heard from today, are quite advanced. Many are really struggling with the practicalities of how you build ESG and criteria into the portfolio and then into the individual mandates that they have with their managers. So they're still learning, boards are still learning. Regulators and standard setters, I think we heard very clearly today that it's not the lack of activity that's the issue, it's the difficulty of pinning it down and coordinating it in a way that gives you some sort of global consistency on this. And that's, there are several hundred different frameworks if you add all the ones that are global, national and regional together. So there's a long way to go before we have a clear path on that. There's a lot of good work being done to try and integrate those at the moment, but it'll be a while before we see the benefits of that, or you as board members and a board advisors see the benefits of that. And the final area, which was touched on at various points, I think, is the data quality. There is a lot of work to be done before boards and investors can be sure that they're getting the sort of data that they can rely on to make very significant investment decisions. Again, in a slightly different context, we've been looking recently at the activities of rating agencies who produce ESG ratings for companies. And with one or two exceptions, the basis on which they do that, the methodology they use, is extremely opaque. It may be very good, but nobody can tell from outside. I think there's a reference to a black box earlier today at one point. I think it's very similar to that in terms of the data quality. So I think I would like to stand here and say everything will be sorted soon and it'll all become much clearer. And by the time we gather next year, we'll all be laughing at how we worried about these things. I think it's going to be an uncertain and challenging environment for everybody in this for the foreseeable future. And then the only very final thing I wanted to say, which was a much less inspiring version of Sandra's closing remarks, which I thought would ideally have been the final message for the conference, because I think that's the real message that people need to take away, is if you as companies have an opportunity to engage with investors, regulators and standard setters in this, please do so. I used to be a regulator myself, and I can tell you that the only things I ever got close to getting a right decision on were ones where I sat down with the companies and they took me through the practical implications of what some of the decisions and we were having to think were. And as I said, standards are changing, rules are being introduced all the time, investors' thinking is developing. Please, if you do get the opportunity, try and sit down and inform that, because you a much better outcome for all parties concerned. And in this area, sustainability, it's in everybody's interest that we get these things right. So I shall finish there, and I think we hand back to Dr. Ashraf for final words. Is that correct?
Thank you very much for these very insightful takeaways for us to consider. Dr. Ashraf, would you like to join me for you to give in the final word and to close the conference? And before that, I would like to thank one last time our sponsors for their support of our conference. And I believe we have two representatives from two sponsors that are left with us at this time. Ayman Saadallah from Dealey Trust and Amr Mukhtar from Tonic. Please accept a very small token of appreciation from the Hawkama team.
Okay, thank you so much. You are the champions, actually, who stayed to the end. I really would like to thank every one of you. Special thank you to my team members, I mean, especially Sadia, Arij, and everyone else, actually, who put a lot of effort in this. So thank you, my team. It's a small team, but it's a brilliant team. So thank you for your efforts. Thanks a lot. We always like to hear your feedback, your comments, your suggestions. Next year we have another event, inshallah. So please give us your input, what you'd like us to see doing, what service you'd like to have from us. And I'll see you on other occasions. So keep following us. You will see lots of events happening soon, inshallah. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening. Thank you.